My husband and I, Nadir, sitting in the front row playing photographer today. We've been here for a few hours touring around and have been able to see all of the changes over the course of the past decade. And it's been really nice to see, how things have changed in the past few years, which has been really exciting. So when I started here, I'll go through it. I've just got a few presentation slides as well. When I started here, all of these campus faculty buildings were just being constructed, and so it was really exciting to see everything that, like, we had a few lectures in this hall, I remember as well, but even like the simulation room, for example, and so it's been very kind to show us around, so we've really appreciated it. So what I've got here today for everybody, I don't need to talk the entire time. I'm hopeful that some of you have some questions as well. And I know I was actually sent some questions beforehand, so I can go through some of those too. But I'll talk a little bit about myself, which is not something that I actually do very often in public speaking. But I'll explain a little bit about really what's happened to me over the course of the past decade since I left here. As was mentioned, when I left here, I was actually the valedictorian, and so I made our final address to everybody. So it's kind of interesting to see how things have changed. So what I've got here, you can see the QR codes in the corner. They are to, I believe, my Twitter, although I'm awful at Twitter, and also to my LinkedIn. If any of you do want to connect or want to ask me any questions in the future or anything like that, I'm more than happy to at any point in time. I recognize that we can't get through absolutely everything within an hour and some questions afterwards. And this is a view from the hospital that I work at. So, which looks quite nice, especially, this is a lake, not an ocean, I'd like to point out. But I do a few different things nowadays. So I think one of the things that I expected to be doing, and one of the things that I trained for, is what you can see in the top right-hand corner there, which is me as an infectious disease physician. So I am medical director of our infectious disease outpatient clinic at the hospital that I work at. I practice clinically in infectious diseases, and I do a little bit of internal medicine too, but primarily infectious diseases. And that's the job that I trained for. That's the job that, of course, I went to medical school for 6 years for, and then I went to a residency program and fellowship afterwards, all of which I'll explain. But I do a bunch of other things too. And I think that it's important to point out and to recognize that, particularly as medical students, we train for the job that I'm doing on the far right-hand side, but you will do other things. Medicine isn't just the actual care of patients. And I know that might sound silly if you're halfway through your pathophysiology exams, or if you're studying for your surgical finals, or if you're going through trying to remember how to read an ECG. I recognize that that's the be-all, end-all, and that's everything that you're thinking about right now, but it's also not everything that I do. So the other picture, me in the hard hat, I actually don't do a lot of construction, but that was from some of the early days of COVID. In the hospital that I work in, one of the administrative jobs that I had at the time was as medical director of infection prevention and control, which is kind of the part of the hospital that tries to manage other people getting infected with other things. So, as one can imagine, throughout COVID, it's been quite tough, and that was a really big job. And so the reason why I'm wearing a hard hat is because, like many other places around the world, can I just grab my water? Like many other places around the world, we had to build extra facilities, and that one was ours. So we built an extra facility that we had to house extra patients in throughout COVID. And as my job as the medical director of infection prevention and control, I had to make sure that the standards for preventing those infections, everything from air control to making sure there wasn't too much dust during the actual construction, that they were all functional, which I can assure you I had never expected I would be doing. Another thing that I do that you can't see picture behind there is I teach. I teach a lot. The medical school that is closest to where I now work is in a city called Hamilton, which is about an hour outside of Toronto, which is the largest city in Canada. And Hamilton is where I moved to do my infectious diseases fellowship. And it's also where I stayed afterwards to complete my MBA. And I did an MBA that focused on the tech industry and on digital transformation, and that's also where I still teach. So I still teach a healthcare innovation course. I teach a course on how to give presentations to other doctors, for doctors, and having those other opportunities, again, it's something that I would have never really expected. And those are skills, the presentation skills, etc., that I learned when I was here. Not in the classes, but when I was MIMSA president, because I had to give lots of lectures, and I had to give lots of little presentations, and I had to welcome everybody every year to the school itself. And it really gave me an opportunity to hone those skills. Now, I'm not going to give any of my presentation today in Czech, because my Czech is now terrible. But when I was here, I also used to give some presentations in Czech. Again, not nearly as well as I can in English. But it's important, and it's those extra skills, like taking the Czech classes and that. So my family is Czech, but I grew up in Toronto. And really, before moving here, I could say things like Veselé Vánoce to my grandmother, and that was about it. Merry Christmas, for those of you who are not paying attention in Czech class. But it is so important, right? To develop those skills, not only to talk to other people in large rooms like this, sure, but also one-on-one, especially when people are sick and when they're suffering and when they're in pain like you would expect in hospitals. So those are all skills that I learned while I was here as well. And those themselves are skills that I use now all the time in the bottom picture that you can see there. So the bottom picture, where I look much better than now because it's all good lighting, is me on national television in Canada, which is something that I do on a surprisingly regular basis nowadays because of COVID. So as an infectious disease physician and as medical director of infection prevention and control at the beginning of COVID, I had the opportunity, I'll call it, to be on our national radio programs and national news programs all the time. I think there was a time that I was on, every day, to talk about everything COVID, what you should do, what vaccines you should get, any of them, and whether you should wear a mask and things like that. And so those are, again, skills that I learned here in medical school, but not in those classes. And it really was a reminder to me all the time that part of my job here, and I remember, I think one of the courses at the time, it was called psychology here, which it really wasn't, but it was how to communicate with patients. It was so important. And I remember our classes, it was kind of a small classroom in our little group, I think it was in second year, I want to say, and learning how to talk to patients, how to talk to other doctors, how to use those communication skills. Indeed, of course, here we were learning how to use them in Czech as well. But these are the skills that I use on a daily basis in my kind of non-clinical roles. So that's a little bit about where I've come in the past 10 years. But beforehand, and then, so this is also the education that I had after I left here. Those are the things that I've done. I'm actually going to come back to this, I think, but just before I do, this is what I was like when I was here. So, for those of you who've been in Helena's office, I'm not sure if you have the picture up all the time, but there's a picture of this same group in a more formal way. And this was when I was president of MIMSA. So when I was president of MIMSA, MIMSA had been around for about 2-3 years, and one of the things that I did was help develop the election protocol. And I was the first elected president of MIMSA, which is what you can see there. It was very exciting. And the rest of the people around me were the executive that we had way back when. I think it's a little bit different than the executive composure that you have nowadays, because I had the opportunity to look on your website. But we had, of course, people that were working towards a social calendar and planning the orientation week and the academic calendar. And we had mostly academics, I think, actually. But so maybe we weren't as cool then as we are now. But that was the group that I was in charge of when I was here. And again, it was something that I was really proud of being able to do. Starting the orientation week program here, starting the elections program with MIMSA. And these are the types of things that I think allowed me to develop some of those extra skills that introduced me to a lot of other people here, not only within the international school, but in the Czech classes as well. As you can see, like Jan, who's in the background there, was one of my friends that I met when I was here because of this job. And so it reminds us all, I think, it reminded me time and time again, of where I was and what I was doing. So, as I alluded to, I've done a number of things after I left. I know a lot of the questions that I got beforehand will be about how I got to this point. So I'm going to spend a lot more time on this afterwards. But in Canada, it's very similar to the medical education system in the United States, which you might be more familiar with. So in North America, after you finish medical school, you go into what we call postgraduate medical education. And postgraduate medical education is everything from residency programs to fellowship. And in the United States, they also do something called internship, which is an often initial program that you kind of get exposed to everything. And it's very similar to the UK system, where they've got an FY1, an FY2, or F1, F2 year, where you rotate through absolutely everything and hopefully find something that you like. We don't do that in Canada. We just do a residency and a fellowship piece. So that's what I did. I did an internal medicine residency program. It was 3 years long. Could be 4 if you wanted to. And I did that at the University of Saskatchewan, which is kind of right in the middle of the country, and it's very cold. And it's where my mother is from. And then the second program that I did, the fellowship, was in infectious diseases. And that's the program that I did at Masaryk University, where I'm now an assistant clinical professor, and that's where I continue to teach. The last thing you'll see on the bottom there is that I have an MBA as well. Why I went back to school after finishing everything and being able to actually work and make money. And I ask myself the same thing all the time. But I've done it now, it's behind me, so that's great. But the reason why I did that was, again, to help round out some of those other skills that I've talked a lot about at the beginning. Those skills in how to speak with other people, those skills in how to develop businesses. At the time, initially, it was intended so that I could develop other clinics. But of course, through COVID, everything changed, and so I had the opportunity to use the skills that I learned in the MBA to actually change the clinics that I ran and also other clinics around my hospital into virtual clinics, which we can come back to in a little while. So all of those things, all of the formal education, it was a lot of exams at the very end of it, and a lot of exams to even get there. So I think that's what I'm going to be talking about next. So this is going to be the crux of, I think, why a lot of you are here to learn about it. So is anyone from Canada or the United States? You're from Canada?
Yeah.
Well, what part?
London, Ontario.
Oh, lovely. Did you grow up in London?
Yeah.
That's good. So London is about an hour and a half away from where I live. And actually where my husband did his MBA. So he spent an inordinate length of time in London. It's a beautiful city. But, so for the rest of you, or most of you from, maybe hands up if you're from Europe. Hands up if you're from the Middle East. Canada's almost the same, so I'm kidding. And hands up, so those of you who didn't put your hands up, where else are you from? Just shout it out, please, just so I know.
From India.
From India, okay, perfect.
I'm from Mexico.
Okay, yeah, well, you're right, I didn't say North America. Yeah, okay, great. Anywhere else? India as well? Anywhere that I'm missing? Yes, fair. Thank you. So there's a wide range of individuals, and most people here, aside from yourselves, would be considered international medical graduates, so IMGs, and that's the acronym that you see right there. And in Canada, there are certain medical residency spots that are held on a first round basis for international medical graduates, and certain ones that aren't. So the process by which you get to apply for these spots is complicated. So hands up if you've heard of or done the USMLEs. Oh, heard of. So the USMLEs are the set of exams to go to the United States. Canada, unfortunately, has a very similar set of exams that are maybe a little bit easier, actually, but a very similar set of exams that are unfortunately completely separate from the USMLEs. So there are several sets. So there's the Medical Council of Canada qualifying exams, and so you MCCQE 1 and 2, and then MCCEE, which is another exam that you need to take, and I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It'll come to me. And then in Canada, just like in the United States, where you have in the United States it's called the USMLE Step 2 Clinical Skills, where you're in a room with a standardized patient and showing that you can talk to other human beings in a medical and professional way. And in Canada, they do the same thing, and it's called the NAC OSCE. And all of these steps, the MCCQE1, the MCCEE, and the NAC OSCE are what's required to be able to apply for residency positions in Canada. You want me to say that again? So to even get this process started, you've got lots of exams that you need to do. I know we talk about all of the exams that you do here, and then all of the state exams that you do when you finish here. And then for those of you who want to apply to residency programs in the States, then you've got your USMLEs. And then in Canada, that's where you've got the NAC OSCE, MCCQE1 and MCCEE. Once you've passed all of those exams, and you get a score on those exams as well, that kind of qualifies you to be able to start the process of applying for residency positions in Canada. So in Canada, all residency positions and the application process is centralized. The centralized process for it is something called CARMS. It's the Canadian Residency Matching Service, CARMS. And as I said, every single residency program in Canada, residency, fellowship, subspecialization, absolutely everything, goes through that program. In the United States, there's kind of workarounds, there's a whole bunch of different little ways to do it, and you can apply to programs that are off-cycle, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to do it in the United States. But in Canada, there is one, which, for the purposes of this conversation, actually makes it quite easy. You have to pay for the application. You have to pay for individual applications that go out to the different universities, and to every program that you actually apply to. I might point out as well that you also have to pay for all of the exams beforehand, and they can be quite expensive. Although I know there was a question beforehand, and there are some bursaries, I suppose, from the university here that can help you with some of these exams. Is that true? For the USMLE? Yeah. So that's great. So I'm going to submit my application because that didn't exist when I was here. The exams are expensive, is the reality. Having the opportunity to have some reimbursement is really helpful. I know for all of you, as part of the international school, you're paying to be here as well. So hopefully there may be some flexibility, but the reality is money, and any way to help out with that I think is always very important. So it is always important to ask if there are bursary programs, but to recognize that applications to any sort of program in North America or at least in Canada and the United States, I should say, are expensive. So the process itself, though, is entirely online. I think the exam process now is also entirely online because of COVID. So one of the fortunate things, I suppose, about COVID. But the actual application process, the entire CARMS process, even 10 years ago, when I did it way back when, was entirely online. It is a cumbersome set of forms. It asks you everything about you. You need everything from high school degrees to university degrees to everything you did in your spare time. You need extracurriculars. You need everything you've ever thought about in your life goes into this application. You write personal letters about why you really would love to be, a pediatrician training in Vancouver for the next 5 years, and why that's the be-all, end-all for your entire life. And that's really what it amounts to in these personal letters. And you put your heart and your soul into the entire thing. And then out of it, you hope for some interviews. And then the interview process goes in 2 ways. So there's a first round and a second round. A first round interview, you get your file gets kind of sent out to all the universities, and then the universities themselves and the programs will go through all of the files and decide who meets the criteria for them to interview, or who they feel seems like somebody that they would want to have in their program. It's not all about grades. It's also about your interests. It's about your connections to the places. So when I went to the University of Saskatchewan for my internal medicine fellowship, Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is the largest city in that province, in the middle of nowhere, is where my mother is from, and where a lot of my family still lives. So I, believe you me, put that all through the letter, and my entire letter was about how I had grown up going to Saskatoon and had spent a lot of time there, which is true. I spent an inordinate amount of time. You never go in the winter, it's way too cold. And I spent a lot of time there, so I had a lot of connections. Every summer break that I had here, I went and I did electives. Some of the electives that I did were in Saskatoon, actually in pediatrics. One was in respirology, and I met people when I was there. And it's a lot to do with not just who you know, but why there's a connection for you to be in that city. Because so I've been on the other end too of the trying to hire residents. I was our chief resident actually in Saskatoon. So part of my job was to hire new residents. And being on the other side, what you want as an employer is to hire people who want to be there, particularly for a city in the middle of nowhere like Saskatoon, who want to be there and want to stay. So I have a lot of family in Saskatoon, and it would have been very reasonable for me to stay in Saskatoon to work there. I ended up having to leave because of my infectious disease fellowship, because they couldn't get one in Saskatoon. They don't have a program, it's very small. And I actually matched to a fellowship program at McMaster, where I now work, which is actually very close to where I grew up. All great options for me personally, but as I said, what the university is trying to do is trying to build a group of employees that love their jobs, love where they live, and want to stay. Because you need to develop that medical program in that city. So it's kind of a both sides thing. The other city that I actually did a lot of electives in was London, incidentally. So there are a lot of opportunities to do electives throughout Canada and the United States as well. And I would really encourage people throughout their summer, and indeed to do some of their other classes. I did my pediatrics rotation, my final one, actually in Saskatoon instead of here. At the time, that was something that was possible, and I thought it was a great idea. I don't know specifically what opportunities there are nowadays for doing those. I had to fulfill, obviously, very strict criteria to be able to do that pediatrics rotation in Saskatoon, but it really gave me that opportunity to make those connections, to meet those people, and to build those ties to ultimately end up working there. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Does anyone have any questions just at this point here? I know there are a lot of questions here, but I just... No, okay. Yeah?
From the moment of the application, you submit all the documents and exams, everything, how long approximately, if you know how long it takes until you actually can get into the residency program?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, what is the timeline to be able to go through that application process? So the CARMS portfolio, or the CARMS kind of portal, opens in, I think it's August or September of the year before a residency program will start. So for the people, so all residency programs and fellowship programs in Canada start on July 1st, which is a holiday in Canada, so it doesn't make any sense. So they all start on July 2nd. And for that application cycle, it starts in August, September of the year before. So you have a few months to be able to work on all of your documentation, to decide what programs to apply to. All of the programs will have program descriptions and strengths of the program and where it's based, because of course Canada has a lot of rural places. Canada is very remote. Most of Canada is exceptionally remote. So almost all the programs will have a home base at a certain area, and will say as well, our rural component or our other component is here, or you can go there, and we have connections with XYZ place, and these are the opportunities that our program has. So come here, we love it. You apply throughout the autumn, and I think application deadlines are usually at the beginning of December. And then behind the scenes, universities will open these portals and we'll be able to decide who to interview over the coming month. So in January, February, there's about a month of interviews. Again, it's an incredibly inopportune time to have interviews across Canada, because you usually get trapped at the airport because of the snow. But you fly, at the time we flew across the country, literally to interview at different places. Now, of course, you can have a lot of the interviews online, which will be very convenient. And then, to make matters even more complicated, after all of the interviews are done, the universities and the individual will submit a ranking of where they want to go. And that's the whole match program that they use, and the system that they use in the United States as well. We use the same one in Canada. So the university will rank, 100 individuals who they want for their 5 spots, and then you, as an interviewee or medical student, will rank all of the places you want to go to. And the algorithm is hidden, and no one knows what it does, and so on and so forth. But reportedly, the algorithm defers to individuals' rank order list first. So if you really wanted to go to the University of Saskatchewan, that was your number one choice, and then the second one on your list was the University of Toronto, then and they ranked it in a different way. If they both ranked you fairly high, for example, you would go to your number one spot, which would be great. Does that make sense? So timeline, it does take some time, but when you are opening the portal, start it early. It takes a lot longer than it seems. It can, as I said, it can be very, very cumbersome. You have to put in a lot. It's a lot of forms you have to fill out. So it makes a lot of sense to pace yourself and do little bits at a time. That is what I did on the advice from friends of mine, and it was very helpful to be able to do that.
So I know this might not be something that you may know very well, because most of us are not citizens of Canada, basically. Mm-hmm. So do we apply for citizenship or some sort of visa after we get accepted to the residency, or before that?
So there is a lot of information on the website itself. Go to the CARMS website. There's a lot of information on the website about applications for visas and residency permits and things like that. So I did have to have a proof of my residency or of a visa or of citizenship at the time. But I believe that all of that information should be on the website as well. But again, that would be one of the types of things. A visa for permanent residency or for education, etc. in Canada can take quite a long time. So it is important to look into all of that beforehand, but it is all available on the website as well. One of the things that I alluded to earlier on was that there are certain spots that are reserved for international medical graduates, IMGs, and other spots that are reserved for Canadian medical graduates, CMGs. And that is true for the first round only. So everything that I've talked about to this point has been the first round. So on match day, you open up your computer and it says you've matched to infectious diseases at McMaster, which is what I did there. Or it'll open up and it'll say, unfortunately, you haven't matched, which is what happened to me during my first application cycle. So when I first applied for residency from here, I interviewed a whole bunch of places in the first round and I didn't match, which is devastating. But you'll get over it. That's life sometimes. And then it opens a second round. And the second round is a little bit more forgiving. All of the spots are open for anybody. There tend to be lots and lots and lots of international medical graduates that apply. So I was told later on, because they released the statistics a few years later, so in the year that I ended up matching, so I matched in that second round to internal medicine at the University of Saskatchewan. That second round, I believe there were 13 spots that were available across the country in the second round. And I think it was something around 1,700 people that had applied. It's hard. It's a daunting task. 13 slots for 1,700 people. There are a lot of people that don't get matched. And that's one of the reasons why I'm mentioning it, is not to be discouraged. It was the same thing, if not even a little bit easier in terms of numbers for that first round that I didn't match in, because there are fewer spots that are geared specifically for international graduates, keeping in mind that there are very few Canadian graduates that don't match in the first round, and there are spots that are reserved for people that didn't match, people who are international, people who are Canadian but were educated abroad. There's a lot of opportunities. It's an opportunity really to expand your horizons, to apply for different programs in places that you maybe didn't see yourself living in, but again, always looking for those connections to those places. But there's 2 rounds, and then the other major discrepancy, because there are 2 rounds in the United States as well for their match program, but the second round in the United States program is like a free-for-all, and you can contact programs directly, and you can do all these sorts of things. And in Canada, it's still completely centralized. So it's a very organized process. The second round, you don't have to do your application again. You can just gussy it up a little bit and resubmit it to the new programs and that sort of thing with new letters, etc. The program saves everything, thank God. And then you can go through that process again. That process, the turnaround time is much faster. I think you get a week or 2 weeks from the match, the first round match, to when the deadline is for submission for the new one again. It's much, much, much faster. Applications open, the next day. You hear about it a few days after that, and then your interviews are the week after. It's a very, very quick turnaround, because you're looking at these programs that now have, and they wouldn't have been able to predict how many spots they had unmatched, trying to fill those programs. And part of that, of course, for the program itself, is that they get funding from the government for all these programs. The government will fund, the University of Saskatchewan for 5 new pediatricians a year. And they'll say for every single year you get this lump sum of money, and that gets divided amongst all of the people that go there. So you get a salary when you're working as a resident and as a fellow. And to be able to keep that same funding, the programs need to fill the spots. So although you get paid directly from the university, and it's subsidized by the government, and that's some of the incentive, of course, for the program itself. Does that make sense?
Do you know if in the US they have the same problem with competition between IMGs and national?
They do. So the question was whether there's the same level of competition between the United States, between international graduates and local graduates in the United States, and there is. I get the impression that it's more so, which is not surprising. Everyone, I would say, in the world at some point in time thinks that they would want to move to the United States, and I think, I don't know, live the American dream. Every Canadian too, I think, at some point I think, wow, well, maybe I'll move to New York. Even I'm glad that I don't live in New York. There's far too many rats. But I love New York as a point of interest. But I'll stay in Toronto. I think the United States is often seen as I don't whether it's more open to other people coming into the country, but I think it's more well known, and I think it's much easier to see yourself moving to a humongous city like Toronto or LA or Chicago or San Francisco, as opposed to in Canada, where most people have heard of Toronto, and then some people might have heard of Vancouver, and then it's about it. And we used to joke when people, because we were mean, when I was living in Saskatchewan, everybody that would come there would say, oh, well, my dream has always been to move to Saskatchewan and to live here. It's nobody's dream. Saskatchewan's a lovely place, but if you haven't been there before, you don't know that. And respectfully to people from Saskatchewan, most people don't know that. And so we used to ask people to name 2 other cities, and almost no one could do that, which is fine. Learn about the places that you're going to. There's so many great opportunities, and really I think it is because of the fact that the United States is so well known. And if you have movies from Hollywood and TV shows that, I mean, if you've ever watched Grey's Anatomy, it's in Seattle. What else is in Seattle? But you know about it, and you've heard about it, and if you're looking at a list of programs, you can see Seattle and think, oh, yeah, I've heard of it. It's a little bit rainy. It seems to always be raining in the TV show. It is. But if I told you that Vancouver is very similar to that, it is as well. Vancouver is a beautiful city. I only say that because Nadir's from Vancouver. But it's not true. It's a beautiful city, but it's not as well known as Seattle, for example, because of media. So I really would encourage people to look into Canadian cities or into other countries as well, but this is about Canada. So about Canadian cities, to see what the strengths are about individual cities. I mean, in Saskatchewan and in Saskatoon, the strengths of the program that I was in were the fact that it was a smaller program. I had hands-on experience to do everything. When I got into fellowship, I was the only one who came from a smaller program, and I had experiences and hands-on skills of everything from putting in an arterial line in the ICU to doing a lumbar puncture. And I could only do these things because it was a smaller program. And so I'm an infectious disease physician. And if you want to go, and this is a disappointing thing, but very good for infectious disease, if you want to see what HIV can do when it's untreated or not poorly managed, but when it's allowed to spread, you go to impoverished parts of the country. And in northern Saskatchewan, where I was able to practice a little bit because I was in Saskatoon, that's what I had the opportunity to do. Because of the program in Saskatoon, it's one of the many reasons why I fell in love with the specialty that I do. I saw conditions that I would have never seen if I was working at the University of Toronto. And it's not a slight to the University of Toronto. It's a fabulous place. They produce some of the smartest physicians I have ever met in my life. But if you want to see certain things, you have to know where to look. And so I would say that's my strongest pitch for applying to and researching some of the smaller parts of Canada, the United States as well. But across the world because there are different opportunities in a lot of these smaller locations, and you get to know people, and you get people who will become your mentors and will help you to develop your career, and they'll volunteer you for things like being on TV and national television all the time, which is how I ended up there. I wouldn't have ever been in the position that I'm in had I stuck to applying to only the University of Toronto, for example. I don't know what else. I'm sure that there are still some more questions as well, but I just want to make sure I've talked. Oh, yeah, no, this is all I've got. There you go. That's Lloyd, that's our dog. And he's watching a lecture from Anthony Fauci, who's the old director of the National Institute of Health and did all the COVID things in the United States. So Lloyd's learning a lot, as you can see. Does anyone have any more questions just before I open up to, I've got all the other questions here on my phone, hopefully.
What happens if you said there's the first round and then the second round? What happens if you don't have the second round?
That's a great question. So what happens if you don't match at all? It depends on who you are and what you're doing. Had I not matched, one of the things that I was going to be doing was likely research. I would have applied to different research positions across Canada because I wanted to go back to Canada. But at the same time, I had also applied to training programs in the United Kingdom. I had started the process. It comes a little bit later, or at least it did at the time. I had started the process for applying to spots in the UK. I can speak German as well, so I had also looked at Germany. And I had also looked at the United States as well. And again, speaking to what I talked about earlier, like the places that I applied to in the United States were places that I knew. So I applied to like Hawaii, which would have been lovely. I didn't take a job there though. But it wouldn't have been nice if we lived in Honolulu. Like anyway. There are a lot of other programs and a lot of other opportunities. There are always opportunities to do other training programs, not residency programs, but to familiarize yourself with the residency programs. So you can do and apply for things like externships. So those are unpaid positions, but or observerships, where you can go and follow around medical teams and learn certainly about the way the system there works, but also to meet people. And you need reference letters as part of the application process. And so to be able to have somebody who's writing you a reference letter that is strong, who clearly knows you, knows your skills. Like my reference letters were from here. Of course, in retrospect, I can't remember who wrote them. But reference letters that I had were from here, from my rotations at the time. But I also had reference letters from physicians that I worked with in Canada. And to have those individuals say, Dale's a great guy who I think will do really well here. The reference letters were from Saskatchewan, and his family's from here. He loves it here. This is somebody that you really should consider. Because the reality is, and this is a conversation we were having earlier, Helena and I, is that in Canada, Canadians that train abroad, the vast majority of Canadians that train abroad, train in either the United States or in Ireland, and to a certain extent the United Kingdom, but mostly Ireland. So everybody in Canada that is interviewing for residency positions, they know the different schools across Ireland, they know their RCSI compared with Trinity versus Limerick. And all of the different places, the strengths of the different programs, and what those applicants will be interested in, and where they'll fit in a program. But offering a place to somebody who's trained in the Czech Republic is perhaps a gamble. Because they didn't know what Masaryk University was, they didn't know who I was, and so having somebody local who said, yeah, he worked with us for a month, he knew his stuff, he was good. Clearly wants to come here and clearly knows what he's doing. That's not just a CARMS residency interview thing. I mean, that's a life thing. But which is so important to allow yourself the opportunity to explain who you are and what your strengths are and why you're the person for the job. And I think that's just so important.
So for these recommendation letters, like from the doctors from Canada, did you get them from the doctors you worked with during the electives you did, or?
Yes. Yeah, so I got the reference letters. The people that I asked to provide me with reference letters were those that I worked with when I was in various places across the country. In Western, I had a whole bunch of doctors there in London, and in Saskatchewan as well. So a number of physicians in all of these different places did provide me reference letters, because at the end of the day, the people that are opening these forms want to make sure you're as good as you say you are, and will fit into the system, because it's 5 years of training, and you need to make sure that somebody is trainable. You need to make sure that somebody is excited about learning, excited about, for a lot of people, learning a new system. And it was for me as well, because of course I was educated here, I was used to the hospitals here. And the process by which you even go to the emergency department in Canada is a little bit different than the process here, with kind of more subspecialized urgent care centers and like a surgical emergency and things like that. It's just not the process that we have in Canada. Even here, there's more of a two-tiered healthcare system, which has its strengths and benefits. And in Canada, it's much more like the United Kingdom, with the National Healthcare Service. So learning how to work within different healthcare systems is something that needs to be reflected. And you show people that on the job and by doing the job. And I will say, working throughout my entire summers and Christmas breaks and all that kind of stuff, and on those rotations, they were hard to get. You had to pound the pavement, like you had to really ask a lot of people, and I had to be turned away by pretty well everyone. And I had to be persistent to actually get those, but I firmly believe that it's because of those connections that I got those references that I did, that I was able to get the opportunity to show people what I could do, which is really important. Maybe I'm going to open up, if I can find on my phone, where the questions were, because I've got them here somewhere. Just to make sure that I've gone through everything. So, the first question that I had that was emailed to me beforehand was whether Canadian residency positions were recognized in the United States. Yes, they are. You have to still do the USMLEs 1, 2, and 3, though, if you have a Canadian residency program, then to work in the States, which is fine. I haven't done 3, so I can't work in the States. But 3 wouldn't be a problem. It's based on basic clinical skills, and it's not the really hard one for the USMLEs is number 1, because it's all basic sciences and things that I don't use on a regular basis right now. Except for microbiology, there's a lot of microbiology. I know how to gram stain so well. But there's a lot of connection between Canada and the United States. You do have to do the licensing exams. And there's no transferring between licensing or between kind of qualifying exams. So that differs between Canada and the United States. But because the training is so similar, there's a lot of equivalency. And I mean, a lot of the people that I work with in Canada are people that have trained in the United States as well, Canadians and Americans, who've then moved up to Canada for various reasons.
I would like to ask, how does the order work for the licensing exams? Do you have to do it before you do the application process, or can you do it meanwhile?
You have to so it's better if you do them beforehand, is my understanding, and that's the way that I did them as well. You have to do, I believe, the MCCEE and then the MCCQE1. The MCCQE1 you can actually do much later, but you need to have the NAC-OSCE and the MCCEE beforehand. So before you do the actual application process, I believe you need those first 2 exams, EE, NAC-OSCE, and then the MCCQE1. I think I actually did a month after I started residency. Like I did it in Canada.
So is this the equivalent of the step one, or how does it?
The MCCEE is similar-ish to step one, but a far easier exam. The NAC OSCE is very similar to the step 2 CS, clinical skills, and the MCCQE1 is very similar to step 2. I know it's a lot of acronyms, I'm so sorry. Did it make sense then? Okay.
Yes.
Good.
I have a question. You mentioned the people, the higher people at the residency programs. You mentioned they have strict criteria. So aside from like social activities, volunteering, and all this stuff, like strictly in terms of education, do they really care that much about how much your GPA is in uni, or what grades you got in the MCCE or MCQE, or is it pass fail in these exams?
So they're pass-fail exams, but your marks do matter, actually. So they're pass-fail in the sense that you need to pass them to be given the opportunity to apply. But the higher the score, just like on the USMLE, the higher the score, the more opportunities you'll have. And a lot of the programs will have mark cutoffs, and it'll say, the average people that we accept for this program, their score is X, but our cutoff is Y. So doing as well as you can on those exams is best. You can retake the exams and that sort of thing as well, but often, if I'm not mistaken, I think they can actually see that you've retaken it. So go big or go home. Do the best you can that first time. Just do it.
Do you know anything about the process of, like, I don't know if it actually exists, but I've heard that you can start in either the UK or Ireland and then like transfer to Canada after a few years, but I guess you will still have to do those exams and all the application process and everything.
Yeah, so I actually recently had a lot of contact with an individual who is Canadian, did his F1 and F2 years in the UK, and decided that it wasn't for him and wanted to move back to Canada. And so what you have to do, so after you've done your training programs in the United Kingdom, so those 2 intern years, is not recognized in terms of any time away from your residency program, but frankly, they're skills. Like, it's on-the-job training, and it's on-the-job training on a job that's very similar to what we have in Canada. The UK is a bit unique in the sense that the medical system, the NHS in the UK, is nearly identical to what we have in Canada. Ours is based on theirs. So barring some major discrepancies that I won't get into, it's the same system. So although it won't be formally recognized, it is something you can see on the application. And if somebody was graduating from anywhere, seeing they've had some local-ish experience, and this is something they'll fit in. And they'll know what they're doing, they have the opportunity. And people also know what those programs are, so they know that in your FY or F1 and F2, you're going to be rotating through, really wide-ranging areas of medicine. And so they'll know, okay, but this is what they want. This is what they want to do. So this individual that I was talking about had done all of his rotations, and I think he initially wanted to pursue internal medicine, but decided in the end that psychiatry was really what his interest was, which is great. And so he came back to Canada. He tried to contact everybody he knew, including myself. So he and I went to the same high school, and that's how he and I got in touch with each other, and asked for meetings and asked to talk with people, and did some more psych research and built around his resume to say, look, this is what I've done. I was educated here. I did these programs, and I could tell it wasn't for me. I wanted to come home. I wanted to come, or I wanted to have a different opportunity. I wanted to come to Canada and do this. And that's what he did. So he just matched in the first round to a psych program in Kingston. So we're very excited. I'm going to go back to some of the questions that I had here. But again, if anybody else has any questions, please just ask, interrupt. I'm on board with it. The second question was, did the university pay back the USMLE fee? So yes, there are bursaries. I'm not sure, did you want to talk about that at all, Helena?
We had the information on the website. If you need more details, you can stop over to our office. But definitely, step 1 and step 2, it's recommended to do within your studies. If you pass them successfully and prove the expenses that that it cost you, we will pay you back all those expenses. Of course, if you pass, we have so many steps successfully. Yeah, not if you fail.
And should it be done within the study years, right? Like until the graduation?
I think step 1 should be done. It's recommended. Of course, I suppose that all steps you can do after the graduation. But definitely step 1, you are trained within your studies for the step 1, since the anatomy part phase. So it should be done within until you graduate.
I meant the reimbursement for.
Reimbursement, it's done for the studies that you did until the graduation will be reimbursed, and step 2 if you pass after the graduation is as well.
Is it also for the MCCQE one and the NACOS, or is it just
Because we haven't had the candidates for this. I'm sure that it's equal, so we definitely can discuss it.
Thank you.
Yeah, the door's open.
To the content of the step 1, the content of the step 1 exam is very similar to the first 2 years of education here. So it would make a lot of sense to do it at that time. I think I did it in my 4th year and it was hell. It was really, really hard. Although it meant that I had a really strong depth of knowledge, especially for the months afterwards on my clinical rotations. I was nailing everything about all of our gram stains and stuff. It was really hard to do. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. Which Canadian residencies are open to international graduates? All residency positions. There are opportunities for every type of subspecialist across the board. But there are fewer spots that are available. And the reality is, for certain very competitive programs, they oftentimes, if they've got 10 spots, they'll reserve 1 for an international graduate, for example. It is very competitive. But for things that always are competitive, so things like ophthalmology is very competitive, neurosurgery is very competitive, cardiovascular surgery is very competitive, plastic surgery is very competitive. For all their strengths in all those different fields, they're very, very competitive. And the reality is there are fewer opportunities for foreign trained graduates as a result of that. Without a doubt, the commonest places that we see foreign trained graduates are within family medicine, pathology, and internal medicine, I would say. There's a lot of pathologists that are foreign trained. I don't really know why. Well, that's a great job, so. Does that make sense?
Is there any place where you can check the places available?
Yeah, so on the CARMS website, every single residency position is on there. So all of the opportunities, when people should apply for them, there's so much information on the website. It's actually very easy to navigate. It's a really, really good one. But all of the programs will have a program page. It'll explain all the strengths and weaknesses of their program. It'll also say how many spots are available for both Canadian grads and international grads. And then they'll also, on their website, on the CARMS website, they'll also have statistics for how many people applied, how many filled spots and unfilled spots there were, first round, second round, etc. It is all on there. It's a public, or it's a government company, so they have to publish everything, except for their algorithm, apparently. Are some residencies in the US also restricted to American students as in Canada? Yes. Most positions in the United States, similar to Canada, are for American trained students. And there are different pathways, and in the United States they have like a categorical pathway and a something else pathway, and in the United States it is a little bit more kind of to each their own in terms of the application process. It also lends itself to more opportunities in that second round if you are not shy and direct your calls and emails and et cetera, directly to the programs. That's what gives you strength in the American system. It's much less tightly regulated.